Economic impact of British rule on India क्या है? The economic policies of British rule in India had a profound impact on the Indian economy, society and agriculture. ठीक है. British economic exploitation led to the drain of wealth, deindustrialization and stagnation of Indian agriculture. ठीक है. Home charges and drain of wealth. Definition: home charges मतलब refer to the expenditure incurred in England by the Secretary of State for India on behalf of India. This included dividends to shareholders of East India Company, interest on public debt raised abroad, military and civil expenses and store purchases in England. मतलब होम चार्जेस जो भी इंडिया के लिए काम हो रहा था सब क्या था, भारत से ही लेके जा रहे थे. होम चार्जेस रिफर टू एक्सपेंडिचर incurred in England by Secretary of State for India on behalf of India. ठीक. This included dividends to shareholders of East India Company. ये सब मतलब शेयर होल्डर्स को इंटरेस्ट ऑफ पब्लिक डेब्ट रेज्ड अब्रॉड, मिलिट्री एंड सिविल एक्सपेंसेस एंड स्टोर परचेजेज इन इंग्लैंड. ड्रेन थ्योरी. दादा भाई नौरोजी in his book Poverty and Un-British Rule in India in 1901 estimated that around 30 to 40 million, 3 to 4 crore rupees were drained annually from India to Britain. The wealth generated in India was not reinvested in the country but was instead transferred to England. इसका इम्पैक्ट क्या हुआ? लैक ऑफ कैपिटल फॉर इंडस्ट्रियल ग्रोथ इन इंडिया, स्टैग्नेशन ऑफ इंडियन एग्रीकल्चर एंड इकोनॉमी. ठीक. सीवियर फेमिन्स ड्यू टू लैक ऑफ इन्वेस्टमेंट इन इरिगेशन एंड रूरल वेलफेयर. Impact on Indian banking and trade. Financial leakage. The British ensured that India's banking, insurance and shipping services were dominated by British firms, leading to massive outflow of Indian wealth. Imperial preference policy क्या? British goods were given preferential treatment in India with little or no tariff. Indian exports to Britain were taxed heavily, making Indian industries uncompetitive. Deindustrialization. Indian handicraft and textiles, once a thriving global industry, were deliberately destroyed by British. Charter Act of 1813 ended the East India Company's monopoly over trade. मतलब चार्टर एक्ट 1813 जो है इंडियन मोनोपोली मतलब ट्रेड पे ख़त्म किया, सिर्फ टी और चाइना के ट्रेड के साथ रह गया था. अलाउइंग ब्रिटिश मैन्युफैक्चरर फ्री एक्सेस टू द इंडियन मार्केट. ठीक. इन बाई 1850 इंडिया शेयर इन वर्ल्ड मैन्युफैक्चरिंग आउटपुट फेल फ्रॉम 25% in 1750 to 2% due to British policies, as per economist एंगस मेडिसन. ठीक. अब लैंड रेवेन्यू सिस्टम क्या था ब्रिटिश इंडिया में? परमानेंट सेटलमेंट लॉर्ड कॉर्नवालिस ने लागू किया. कहाँ? बंगाल, बिहार, उड़ीसा और यूपी, पार्ट्स ऑफ यूपी में. बंगाल, बिहार, उड़ीसा, पार्ट ऑफ यूपी. आल्सो नोन एज इस्तेमरारी, जागीरदारी, मालगुजारी एंड बिस्वेदारी. क्या क्या? इस्तेमरारी, जागीरदारी, मालगुजारी एंड बिस्वेदारी. की फीचर्स क्या थे इसके? जमींदार्स वेयर मेड ऑनर्स ऑफ लैंड एंड वेयर रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर कलेक्टिंग लैंड रेवेन्यू फ्रॉम पेशेंट्स. ठीक. जमींदार क्या बनाए गए? लैंड ऑन वेयर मेड लैंड ऑनर्स ऑफ लैंड एंड वेयर रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर कलेक्टिंग लैंड रेवेन्यू फ्रॉम पेशेंट्स. ठीक. They had to pay 10 to 11th of the total revenue to the British. They had to pay 10 by 11th revenue, 10 by 11th to the total revenue to the British and could keep 1 by 11th for themselves. Zamindars were made owners of land and were responsible for collecting land revenue from peasants. मतलब they had to pay, मतलब जितना भी इकट्ठा किया है उसका 10 भाग वो ब्रिटिश आर्मी को देंगे, मतलब ब्रिटिशर्स को देंगे, और 1/11 जो है वो खुद रखेंगे. इफ़ जमींदार फेल्स टू पे देयर लैंड वाज ऑक्शन. अगर वो मतलब पे करना मतलब फेल हो जा रहा है, पे करना नहीं पे कर पा रहे हैं, तो उनकी ज़मीन क्या होगी? ऑक्शन हो जाएगी, नीलाम हो जाएगी. इम्पैक्ट क्या हुआ, क्रिएटेड एन एब्सेंटी लैंडलॉर्ड सिस्टम वेयर जमींदार्स एक्सप्लॉइटेड पेशेंट। ठीक, यहाँ जमींदारों ने प्रताड़ित करना शुरू कर दिया। लेड टू एग्रीकल्चरल स्टैग्नेशन एज जमींदार्स हैड नो इंसेंटिव टू इम्प्रूव लैंड प्रोडक्टिविटी। ठीक, इंक्रीज रूरल इंडेप्टनेस एंड फ्रीक्वेंट पेशेंट्स अपराइजिंग्स। ठीक, तो परमानेंट सेटलमेंट किसने 1793 में लॉर्ड कॉर्नवालिस ने लागू किया। कहाँ कहाँ, उड़ीसा, बिहार, बंगाल और पार्ट्स ऑफ यूपी में। इसे इस्तमरारी, जागीरदारी, मालगुजारी और बिस्वेदारी भी कहते हैं। फिर आता है रियोतवाड़ी सिस्टम। किसने वो किया, थॉमस मुनरो और अलेक्जेंडर रीड ने। कहाँ, 12 महल डिस्ट्रिक्ट ऑफ तमिलनाडु। ठीक, रियोतवाड़ी सिस्टम सबसे पहले 12 महल डिस्ट्रिक्ट तमिलनाडु में किया गया मुनरो और अलेक्जेंडर रीड द्वारा, थॉमस मुनरो और अलेक्जेंडर रीड द्वारा। लेटर इम्प्लीमेंटेड इन मद्रास, बॉम्बे, ईस्ट बंगाल, असम एंड कुर्ग, मॉडर्न कर्नाटक। ठीक, कहाँ कहाँ, मद्रास प्रेसिडेंसी, बॉम्बे, कुर्ग, ईस्ट बंगाल, असम। रियोट्स, पेशेंट वेयर गिवन लैंड, ऑनरशिप ऑफ लैंड, मतलब डायरेक्ट मजदूरों को ही खेत दे दिया गया। रेवेन्यू वाज कलेक्टेड डायरेक्टली फ्रॉम पेशेंट बाय ब्रिटिश गवर्नमेंट। रेट्स वेयर हाई एंड फ्रीक्वेंट रिवाइज्ड, मतलब रेट्स जो थे हाई थे और हर बार मतलब रिवाइज होता था। इम्पैक्ट क्या हुआ, हैवी बर्डन ऑन पेशेंट्स ड्यू टू फ्लक्चुएटिंग टैक्स रेट्स, बहुत ज़्यादा लोड बढ़ गया। पेशेंट्स हैड टू टेक लोन्स फ्रॉम मनी लेंडर्स लीडिंग टू मासिव रूरल डेब्ट, डिक्लाइन इन ट्रेडिशनल विलेज कम्युनिटीज़ एंड कोऑपरेटिव फार्मिंग। ठीक, इससे भी बहुत नुकसान हुआ, रियोतवाड़ी सिस्टम से भी। फिर क्या हुआ, रियोतवाड़ी सिस्टम के बाद महालवाड़ी सिस्टम। ये किसने इंट्रोड्यूस किया, हॉल्ट मैकेंजी ने। लेटर मॉडिफाइड बाय विलियम बेनेडिक्ट। और कहाँ कहाँ, नॉर्थ वेस्टर्न प्रोविंसेस, पंजाब, पार्ट ऑफ सेंट्रल इंडिया। नॉर्थ वेस्टर्न प्रोविंसेस उधर मतलब पाकिस्तान की तरफ, पंजाब एंड पार्ट्स ऑफ सेंट्रल इंडिया, महालवाड़ी सिस्टम। इसमें क्या हुआ, मैकेंजी ने वो किया था और बेंटिक ने समर्थन किया था। द विलेज महाल was collectively responsible for tax payment. Revenue settlement was periodically revised. Land was owned by communities but individuals were responsible for tax payment. Impact क्या हुआ, increased pressure on village communities led to fragmentation of land and inefficiency in agriculture. ठीक, agrarian distress and famine देखा जाए तो British policies led to severe famines in India, over 29 million deaths between 1850 to 1900. Notable famine, Bengal famine 1717 killed over 10 million people. Agrarian policies led to severe famines in India with over 29 million deaths between 1850 to 1900. Notable famine, Bengal famine 1770 killed over 10 million people. Great famine 1876 to 78, over 5 million people died in Madras, Mysore and Bombay presidencies. Bengal famine killed over 10 million people 1770 में. Great famine 1876 to 78, over 5 million people died in Madras, Mysore and Bombay presidency. Bengal famine 1943, around 3 million deaths, worsened by British wartime policies as criticized by Amartya Sen. एक बार 70 में फैमिल आया था, 10 मिलियन लोग मारे गए। फिर 1876 to 1878 over 5 million people died in Madras, Mysore and Bombay. फिर 1943 में around 3 million deaths worsened by British wartime policies. मतलब ब्रिटिश वॉर टाइम पॉलिसीज़ की वजह से बंगाल फेमिन आया 1943 में. डिक्लाइन ऑफ ट्रेडिशनल इंडस्ट्रीज, इंडियन आर्टिसन लास्ट पेट्रोनेज ड्यू टू ब्रिटिश फैक्ट्री मेड गुड्स. By the late 19th century, 80% of India's population was engaged in agriculture due to lack of industrial jobs. Railway construction from 1853 onward helped British goods reach Indian market but did not help local industries. Impact क्या हुआ? Emergence of new middle class. Educated Indian emerged as a class that later led the nationalist movement. Extreme poverty and low wages. British policies ensured that labor remained cheap, benefiting British capitalists. फिर इंडियंस का क्या रिस्पॉन्स रहा ब्रिटिश इकोनॉमी पॉलिसी के खिलाफ? दादा भाई नौरोजी ड्रेन थ्योरी 1876 brought awareness about economic exploitation. Moderate of Indian National Congress 1885 to 1905 like Gopal Krishna Gokhale demanded economic reforms. Like Gopal Krishna Gokhale demanded economic reforms. Swadeshi movement 1905 to 1911 encouraged boycotting British goods and promoting indigenous industries. Swadeshi movement. Indigenous industries. Mahatma Gandhi's economic ideas advocated village industry and self-reliance Gram Swaraj, opposed British economic exploitation through non-cooperation 1920 and civil disobedience 1930 movements. Mahalwari system introduced by Holt Mackenzie in 1822, later modified by Lord William Bentinck. Region covered UP, Punjab, Central Province and part of northwestern India. Revenue collection, the village mahal instead of individual landlords. The land was owned by the village community. Revenue was collectively assessed and paid by the entire community. The system allowed periodic revision of revenue rates, unlike the permanent settlement. Impact क्या हुआ? High taxation burden on villages leading to rural distress. Peasants fell in debt trap due to revenue pressure, led the gradual fragmentation of landholding, causing inefficiency in agriculture. Economic drain of wealth under British rule क्या है? Definition: the constant outflow of Indian wealth to Britain without any adequate economic, commercial or material return. Primary cause of drain: oppressive land revenue policy, heavy taxation with no reinvestment in Indian agriculture. British trade monopoly: Indian raw materials were exported at low prices, while finished British goods were imported at high rates. Extortion by British officials: high salaries of British civil servants and military personnel were paid from Indian revenues. Charter Act of 1813 and its impact. Before 1830, East India Company used Indian revenues to finance British exports. After 1813, British Parliament ended the company's trade monopoly, allowing private British traders to enter Indian markets. Drain of wealth took the form of unrequited exports, where India exported goods but received little or nothing in return, led to rapid deindustrialization of Indian handicrafts and increased dependence on British goods. 1813 चार्टर एक्ट ऑफ 1813 के बाद की बात है. दादा भाई नौरोजी एंड ड्रेन थ्योरी, पायनियर ऑफ इकोनॉमिक नेशनलिज्म, फर्स्ट articulated drain theory in 1876, called the drain of wealth the evil of all devils, responsible for Indian poverty. ठीक, the poverty and un-British rule in India 1901. England's duties to India, पेपर ये लिखा. The wants and means of India on the commerce of India, दादा भाई नौरोजी. Estimate of wealth drain: Nauroji calculated that around 30 to 40 million, 3 to 4 crore rupees were drained annually to Britain. He argued that 1/4 of India's revenue was sent abroad, leading to economic stagnation. 1/4 India, leading to economic stagnation. Political contribution क्या था? First Indian to be elected to the British House of Commons in 1892, लिबरल पार्टी से. ठीक, हाउस ऑफ कॉमन्स में ये सेलेक्ट किए गए थे 1892 में. फाउंडर ऑफ लंदन इंडिया सोसाइटी 1865 with W.C. बनर्जी to highlight Indian exploitation under British rule. Founder of London India Society 1865 with W.C. Banerjee. R.C. Dutt's contribution to economic nationalism. Ramesh Chandra Dutt was another key figure who emphasized economic drain. His book, The Economic History of India, 1901, argued that 50% of India's GDP was being drained annually. ठीक. British land revenue and trade policies destroyed Indian agriculture and industries. Urged for economic reforms and political freedom. Indian National Congress and drain theory. Accepted drain theory in 1896. Calcutta session declared that the primary cause of famines and mass poverty was the continuous economic drain. Moderates like Gopal Krishna Gokhale used drain theory to demand financial accountability from the British. Syed Ahmad Khan's view on British rule. Unlike Nauroji, R.C. Dutt, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, 1817 to 1898, was loyal to British. Syed Ahmad Khan's. He believed that the progress of the Muslim community depended on cooperation with British. Advocated for Western education and scientific learning among the Indian Muslims. Founded Aligarh Muslim University in 1875 to promote मॉडरेट एजुकेशन. ठीक है, अब हम लोग आते हैं PYQs पे. With reference to the period of colonial rule in India, home charges formed an important part of the drain of wealth from India. Which of the following fund constituted home charges? Fund used to support the Indian office in London, बिल्कुल सही है. Fund used to pay salaries and pension of British personnel engaged in India, बिल्कुल सही है. Fund used for waging wars outside India by the British, नहीं, ये नहीं है. Home charges were expenditure incurred in England by the Secretary of State for India on behalf of Indian government. Included home charges, funds for the Indian office in London, administrative expenses, salaries and pensions of British officers, military personnel and retired officers. Interest on railway capital investment and public debt raised abroad, सही है. Military store purchases and civil administration expenses क्या नहीं इंक्लूड था? War outside India, जैसे British war in Burma, Afghanistan, etc., were not part of home charges. These were covered by separate military expenditures. Fund used to support the Indian office in London. British administrative control over Indian required expenses in London paid from Indian revenues. Funds used to pay British salaries and pensions. Indian paid for its own colonization, including high salaries of British officers. मतलब हम लोग खुद के colonization के लिए पे कर रहे थे. Funds for foreign wars, these were financed separately, though India was sometimes forced to contribute. Dada Bhai Nauroji, drain of wealth theory, 1876, 1/4 of India's revenue was sent abroad. R.C. Dutt, 1901, home charges led to economic stagnation and rural poverty. Home charges led to economic stagnation and rural poverty. Indian National Congress, 1896, Calcutta session declared that home charges were a major cause of Indian poverty. The term imperial preference was applied to special privileges on British imports in India, बिल्कुल सही है. Imperial preference refers to a system where British goods receive preferential treatment in Indian markets while Indian goods faced heavy tariffs in Britain. जैसे nominal duty on British imports in India while Indian textile exports to Britain were taxed heavily up to 80% of the in the early 19th century. Export हम लोग कर रहे हैं, उस पर भी हम लोग ड्यूटी दे रहे हैं. Charter Act of 1830 ended the East India Company's monopoly but allowed unrestricted British imports, leading to deindustrialization of India. ठीक. Special privileges on British imports allowed British goods to dominate Indian markets. Racial discrimination, though racism was prevalent, imperial preference was an economic policy, not a racial law. Subordination of Indian interest, this was a broader colonial policy, not specific to trade policy. British political agents over Indian princes, not direct link with imperial preference. British cotton textile imports 1815 to 1850 increased from 5% to 15% of Indian market share. Swadeshi movement 1905 फर्स्ट मेजर रिएक्शन अगेंस्ट इंपीरियल प्रेफरेंस पॉलिसीज। ठीक, तो यहीं तक हम लोग करते हैं, बाकी अगले पार्ट में करेंगे। थैंक यू, बाय बाय।